What's up, everybody? As I've mentioned in previous episodes, when I dropped into this YouTube space to actively participate in the Think Out Loud with People side of YouTube back in January, I had no real deep concept of the scene that had been brewing downstream from Jordan B. Peterson, Jonathan Peugeot, and John Vervaeke, being encouraged by Paul Vanderklay. This scene, this little corner of the internet, the TLC, is real. However, I was quickly embraced and vetted over the ensuing weeks. On this journey, a revered name kept popping up in various conversations and various stories on channels on the Friday Morning Nameless, in live streams on Grail Country, and on Paul's channel. The name Karen and the channel called The Meaning Code were mentioned with a sense of respect and honor. I, however, was immediately pulled into the microculture surrounding Grim Grizz and the characters involved over there. I've since been expanding my understanding of who and what makes up this history unfolding downstream from Paul Vanderklay and the TLC. Closing in on 4 months and around 20 podcasts, I'm finally connecting with Karen today. From the digital trail, I've gathered a few pieces of information about Karen. She's a wife and mother, an artist, a thinker, and an out-loud processor. She's a YouTuber operating her channel called The Meaning Code, of which the channel description reads, mapping the universe through physics, art, economics, philosophy, and more. The search for meaning through connections from one domain of knowledge to another, finding the code that connects the substructures of the universe. She started the official podcast work of the channel around 4 years ago. Having been deeply inspired by the Jordan Peterson Phenomenon, and more directly by one Paul Vanderklay and his work of synthesizing the current landscape around Jordan, inspiring many to begin the journey of doing the same. She has had many wide-ranging conversations with a wide array of interesting people like Gabriel Stuckey and Ian McGilchrist, as well as Tammy Peterson and Sherry from Grail Country, as well as many more in between. It is my distinct honor to have her on as my first female guest on the Yours Truly podcast. I'm excited to see where we converge as we practice some conversation craft here today. So without any further delay, I give you Karen Wong from The Meaning Code. Hi, this is Christian Baxter, and you're listening to Yours Truly, a place we go to think out loud. And we're recording. Hi, Karen.
Hi, Christian. What a lovely introduction. That was amazing. Thank you.
It's fun. This is fun. As I've said to a few people, this is just playing. The word authenticity gets thrown around here a lot about what people are doing. Is this real? And this is me being authentic to who I am, I guess. It's all these toys, all these digital toys that I've learned to play with, So that's where that comes from. So my first question for you, Karen, I guess was how do you see how we got to this conversation today?
The way that I looked at it from the beginning, and I still think it's true, is that when Jordan Peterson started rising up in the public consciousness, it felt to me as though, well, first of all, it felt to me as though something was really happening there. Even before he started getting famous, I could see. And then as it went along, and it became more and more apparent to me that there was something really happening there. And it also seemed to me that he had discovered a problem. When he wrote Maps of Meaning, he said the reason he wrote that book is that it took him many years to figure out what the question was. But once he had the question, that was the beginning of his journey. And his question was, why did this 20th century disintegrate under Nazism and communism? And would we be in danger of that happening again? And I felt as though he was taking that problem and outsourcing it into the cyber void. And a bunch of us came alongside and said, hey, if you're outsourcing that problem, maybe each of us can take a little piece of it and work on it. And so that's what I decided to do, is just, I can only take a little piece of it that's within my own sphere, but that little piece I can work on. So And what I've seen happen is it's distributed out and more people have gotten involved. It does seem like that outsourced problem has started to flowers have popped up here and there and the garden is growing. And recently I've noticed that more and more people are coming to roughly the same conclusion, and they're drawing a picture. You could take all those pictures and lay them on top of each other and you'd get a picture of great depth. But each of the pictures is just a little bit different. They each come up with the same, you could call it the same pattern or the same image. And it's the same image that I had 20 years ago when I started thinking about these things. So it's very interesting to me how that's happening. And then more and more channels are popping up, and each one is navigating their own little space and taking their own little piece of the problem. And anyway, I think of this as an outsource, like crowdsourcing.
Yeah, I recently heard Jordan Hall talk about a cybernetic conversation that's happening out of sync at different times all over the place. And that this conversation could be heard years from now, or any conversation that we've had in this kind of digital space that is asking that question or trying to understand maybe that problem. And it's an amazing time to be seeing that. And I definitely see how I got here and how this is happening as a result of Peterson, from, at least my first interactions with him about 2016, 2017 online. And so what do you think when you said we all are kind of like maybe trying to answer that problem? Well, what would you say the answer you're trying to, give it connected to that?
Well, I think if I boil his problem down to the minimum, it's not even just asking a question about how did Nazism and communism arise, but why is it that we as human beings find it so hard to tell the truth?
Mm.
And is there such a thing as truth? And if there is such a thing as truth, what does that look like? And what do we do in our daily lives and in all of our activities and everything that happens as human beings and in humanity in general that is part of that search for truth? And that's what I think the question is, really. The reason it gets interesting with physics and art and things like that, like in science, they will say, well, all we can ever discover is little facts, things that work, but but there is no such thing as absolute truth, because if you believed that there was absolute truth, then you would have to believe that there was some purpose for all of this and we're all headed towards something. And they don't want to think that way, so they just think about the truths that they discover along the way. But when you actually dig down into all of these different arenas and you discover this same path of seeking truth, obviously that's what scientists are doing when they have a theory and then they do experiments. They're trying to navigate with that experiment, trying to find out whether or not the theory is true.
Yep.
Or the theory has some validity. So they do this experiment. And that's what we do every day. We get up and we make an experiment out of our lives. We go for a walk, and if we fall into a ditch, then we were on the wrong path, right? So it's the same picture in every arena. And I got there because I started thinking about the process of art and how the process of art works. But because that's my field, I dug deep down into it. And I started to see that deep pattern of how the process of art works seems to me like that is how the universe came to be, is through that deep process of art, as though the entire universe is an ongoing work of art in the hands of the great designer, the great father, the great creator, whatever word you want to use, for the King of Kings. And that pattern is such a deep and rich pattern. And then to see how that pattern plays out in all these other fields is just very, very interesting to me. problem is it's such a big picture that I can't articulate it in anything more than tiny little bits here and there because I go nuts trying to talk about the whole thing.
That brings me two threads. One is Jordan Peterson's logo, this thing.
Mhm. Yeah.
Did you see, I don't know how recent it was, but Dr. Oz at one point did a tour with him in an office that he had, and he had a huge picture, huge 3D version of this on the wall.
Well, his original artwork was a 3D artwork.
He's got it in this
Yeah.
on that video. So I guess you understand that story. Well, when I saw that and I was thinking about our conversation related to you as an artist, that's something that came into my mind. And that almost sounds like what this looks like. I don't know if that makes sense.
Oh, you mean the construction of the universe?
Yeah, well, yeah, and that there's all these pieces trying to come together that are all different and don't necessarily all make sense, but there's something there. I don't know. And
Yeah. Oh, I mean, for sure. I always try to find some way to articulate this that will make sense. And in my own mind, I started to get a clearer picture of it when I started looking at Stephen Wolfram's new theory of fundamental physics. And maybe it doesn't make sense to anybody who hasn't heard him talk, but his theory of fundamental physics is based on these kind of hypergraphs and diagrams and but let me see how I could describe this without having to talk about Stephen Wolfram. Well, let me look at it from a work of art. Okay, so an artist is painting a painting. And maybe I have a picture in my mind. I'm trying to recreate that picture on the canvas. And maybe at some point I make a stroke of paint and I look at it and I go, oh, that didn't really end up in the place that I wanted it to be. Or maybe it's too thick, or maybe it's the wrong color or something like that. I can go back and I can change that. I can change the color. I can paint over it. I can draw lines through it. I can spread it out more. There are many different avenues that I can take to fix that problem so that it will come back and become part of the unity again of the original concept. So it gets back to that original concept. But now imagine that those strokes of paint are not being managed by a painter, but each of those strokes of paint has its own will. It has its own purpose, and it's that each stroke of paint has its own program, let's say, inside, so that it's moving around on the canvas. And some of the strokes get in the wrong place, and they need to be transformed so that the unity can come back together again. The point is that transformation is always possible. And that's kind of the way I see the universe working, is that we're going out living our lives. We stumble, we take a wrong path, we make a mistake. That doesn't mean that the end is here. It means that maybe the final end is going to be slightly different than it was originally thought of to be, but it still has the potential of being a good end if we put it back into the hand of the master and let the master help us to move back into the right place. All those things that happen in between. The thing with an artist when you're working on a painting is that every stroke you make, even if you decide that it wasn't exactly what you wanted, it changes the context of the full image. And so maybe the image as it arises out of that is actually richer than the original image that you thought of. So, and maybe I think that way because of the way I paint, because I don't start with a white canvas and then try to paint a pretty picture on the white canvas. I create a lot of chaos and then I look and I see the patterns, and then I start to paint kind of on top of the chaos. And if something isn't working, maybe I'll go in and I'll add some more chaos, or maybe I'll go in and I'll scratch something out with some black paint and then go back over it again. And so I'm always layering. And I started to think that's kind of what my life is like too. Like I get messed up, but then I learn from that and I grow, and that's another layer. But each of those layers underneath actually have some meaning or purpose, because um, at church yesterday, the pastor was teaching from the book of Esther, and it's really good series. And he was talking about how the book of Esther is the one book in the Bible where God doesn't show up at all. He's not mentioned anywhere in the book of Esther. But if you're reading the book of Esther, you can see God everywhere. Even though he's not mentioned, you can see him everywhere, especially if you go to the end of the story and then go back through the book to the beginning. And I think that's the way life is. Like if I told you the end of my story now, if I go back through that to the beginning, all those things that happened in my life make so much more sense from this vantage point than they did when they were happening.
Yeah.
And everything that happens changes the context. And when the context changes, then everything around it has to change. So the context basically creates a constraint for the next thing that happens. And the context is always changing the constraints. And that's how we move forward. And that's the way science works. It's the way art works. It's the way life works.
Yeah. And we live in such an analytical world that says, no, these things this has to stay over here. This has to stay over here. These things, and neither two shall meet. Science, faith, all those things. The other thread that I was following is when you said basically that, I don't know how you exactly put it a few minutes ago about, well, it's a type of search for truth, is seeking of truth, finding truth. And that truth isn't just, this thinking or knowing the right things, but it's like a pursuit of, a through line of, like in your painting, like oh, no, that, or like you said, your life, like, no, that wasn't true. That wasn't the truth, the true way or something.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, that's really why I stumbled into doing this was, you talk about your life falling onto the ditch and having to find that is a very real way that the Peterson thing, the project that he set out and where it intersected with my life was very much in becoming a true person, a truer or more person full of truth, as opposed to, pardon me, a person not full of truth. And that was in the context of like my marriage and the fact that I used to be a pastor at a church, and that I broke my vows in my marriage, and I had to come in contact with what does it mean to not just be like, well, I believe all the things that I'm supposed to believe, but no, what does it mean to be a true person? And I think Peterson's project of the individual, about how do you get to the gulag and how do you get to the gas chambers, is individuals losing touch with what it means to be truthful, and so I think that's the fruit of that in my life, and why we're having this conversation. And when you said that, it just was like right there. And and I think that I listened to, and I was just trying to search it a few minutes ago, a conversation that you had with a gentleman, and he's an AI engineer of some kind. I think it was recent, but I'm not sure.
Balazs Kegel?
I think so. And y'all talked about building, well, he was talking about building up science in this pursuit of truth. Like, this problem that we're in about science being based on all the right facts and not about maybe the individual pursuit of a certain scientist, an honest and a earnest pursuit and an ethical pursuit. That's actually where the true science comes from. Not like, well, I'm thinking that I got the right facts about this, or I'm going to try to make this have the right fact. No, like that's not science. But I feel like that's what we kind of find ourselves in. I loved that, and how you're coming at that just looking at, as well as like looking at a canvas. I wondered, I was
Well,
listening. Go ahead. Yeah,
the thing you just said there is so important, because that points back to several years ago. Glenn, who's been on my channel a number of times, pointed me to this lecture by a physicist by the name of Nima Arkani Hamed, and it's called The Morality of Fundamental Physics. And that whole lecture is about that, about how the pursuit for truth in science has to be based on a kind of morality.
Yeah.
He says in the lecture, I'm an atheist, but he said, this is just how it works. It has to work this way. And he gives this really brilliant lecture. It's really marvelous. You can watch the first 35 minutes of it and you get the main thrust of it if you don't have an hour and a half. And I can give it to you later. You can put it in the description section.
Okay.
But when what you said earlier, when you were talking about how when we fall off the rails, and in the world, I mean, the typical language that people use is to say something like sin.
Sure.
But in the scripture, when it uses that word sin in the Greek, and Jordan Peterson has talked about this too a number of times, and if you've been around the church for 40 years, you learn this, that it's missing the mark.
Yeah.
It's an archery term, and that turns up in a lot of different places. Like in carpentry, you have to true up your measurements. And so, and I also think that judgment is measurement. It's a kind of a measurement. Judgment is just, where do you fall? You know, I used to be an intercultural consultant, and we would do these team meetings and kind of go into companies and do trust walks and team gatherings and teach people about teamwork and all of this kind of stuff. And then after the meeting is over, this is back before the internet, we had flip charts. You put the flip chart up and then you say, okay, what went well in that meeting? And everybody brings in what they think went well. And then you say, what didn't go well? Okay, that's basically, where did I hit the mark and where did I miss the mark? This is what life is about. Did you hit the mark or did you miss the mark? It's not, are you a good person or are you a bad person? It's your life is navigating towards some measure, some truth, some fittedness up against, I tend to think we're fitting up against the goodness of being.
Yeah.
We're approaching the goodness of being. And if we shrink back from that and say, no, I don't want to go there, then we're going to miss out. But if we're willing to keep pursuing that goodness of being and bumping up against it, sometimes when we bump up against it, what we're finding out is maybe we went too far and maybe that hurts, or sometimes we bump up against it and we fall over because, maybe it's too much for us at that moment. Other times we bump up against it. It's very comforting to know that you're in the right place. And that's this whole thing of having a true measurement or being fitted to the beauty of reality. And I just think that's a picture of the way the universe works.
Yeah. I went back and listened to your very first podcast that you released. I can't remember the gentleman's name you were talking to. And
Alex.
And y'all talked about the difference between saying something, oh, that's good, or instead of something, no, that is the good. That's a representation of the good, the true, the beautiful. And that in our language, we've kind of, again, like separated that out and made, well, that, and you said that discovering something about like an ontological good of life. And we're so afraid to talk about absolutes in our culture, in our world, because of relative postmodernism, and I do think that is what Peterson cut through in a way with that. And that's definitely, talking about bumping up against truth and ontological truth. That was what I came in a very visceral way to come to that point, to become honest, to become truthful, and was like, it was at the right time. It was a very painful thing, like you're saying, but to come to that point, to be able to say, no, this is the truth, and continue that practice of bumping. That's it's not. It's a journey of continuing that practice, and I've called that something like confession,
Mhm.
as a practice, as like a spiritual practice to stay within, to stay aiming at the right thing.
Mhm.
And so I'm with you on that.
Well, that's one of the things I love about Peterson is that although Maps of Meaning is a long, complicated book, basically what he's doing is simplifying all of life down to gratitude and humility and aiming up. It's not your location, it's not your position, it's your trajectory.
Yeah.
So even if today you can only make a little tiny bit of progress, you can at least look back and say, I'm not where I was yesterday. So you're not comparing yourself to anybody else. You're not better or worse than anybody else. You're just in kind of looking at your own self and saying, what trajectory am I on? And, C.S. Lewis talked about this a lot, that every person that you see is either on this trajectory or on this trajectory.
Great
And
divorce.
if they're on this trajectory, you might be looking at someone who someday you will want to bow at their feet because they're going to be so beautifully, radiantly splendiferous. But if they're headed the other direction, you might want to run tail from the other side.
Yeah.
And so when you think about that in terms of your own life, which is how we should look at every message, not, I'm not looking at this so that somebody else can get the story out of it. I'm looking at it because there's something for me here to learn. If I'm on that downward trajectory, I'm going to look like some of those monsters that Lewis wrote about. Like, I used to reread The Great Divorce about every 3 years just to remind myself
I do the same.
about what you can get to very quickly if you get on the wrong trajectory.
Yeah. I think it was my third time, earlier this year. It's a beautifully simple
Yeah.
metaphor with a wink at the end.
Yeah.
I so with that, you've been, I think, doing these conversations podcast thing for about 4 years. Like, and in that first video you credited like Paul Vanderklay for kind of launching you, or inspiring you to set out on your own. Um, and in this little corner space, I think you're one of the earlier people to kind of develop something and continue it, I guess, continue that pursuit. And it was enough to, well, you had something inside of you that was calling you out to that. So how did you kind of come to that? What were the pieces of that?
Well, when I was reading Maps of Meaning, and he talked about how important it is to have a question. And that book actually gave me my question because and I've talked about this before, so I hope it's not boring to anybody. But as I was reading Maps of Meaning the first time through, I discovered that it was way above my pay grade. It's very complicated. The language is very dense. Every sentence could be a book. And he's talking about things that I didn't know anything about because I had no background in physics or philosophy or um, evolutionary biology or any of those things he was talking about. But I did understand art.
Hmm.
And I got most of the way through that book the first time when all of a sudden I made a discovery that if I let myself relax and see it through the lens of art, I could understand exactly what he was talking about. I could I could open that book to any page and pick any paragraph and read the paragraph, and I could show you how it lines up with the process of art making. And I thought that is very weird. Why would that very complicated, arcane archetypal scientific book line up with the process of art making. But it does. And so I thought, I'm going to explore that. And the only way I could explore it would be to talk to a lot of people who were in the fields that he's talking about. So I've talked to biologists and chemists and philosophers and physicists and tried to understand if, without telling them too much about what I was thinking, I was just trying to see what they were thinking. And then in my own head, I can kind of weave it together and go, oh, yeah, that's it. That's the process of art. What that implies to me is that underneath everything, there's a design. And I don't mean design in the way that intelligent design people think about it. I don't have anything for or against intelligent design, so I'm not making a statement about that. But they tend to look at things as though a design went poof, and then you have a design, and now you're going to use that design for various things. I think it more in terms of how design can be a process, and in which that process plays out according to certain principles. And so it's the principles that are important. That this is where it gets hard to find a verb. It's not that the principles govern the design, but they sort of create a framework in which the design can work itself out. And I've not found a way to actually put into words what I mean there, but the principles of design are unity, harmony, contrast, dominance, repetition, variation, gradation, and balance. And if I start talking about these principles, you will see right away Jonathan Pajot, all his stuff, because unity obviously gets to this idea of identity. But unity doesn't mean that everything is the same. Unity means that all of the all of the multiplicity is coming together into one identity. So in a painting, you might have thousands of strokes of paint of all different colors and textures and light and dark and everything. But when you look at the painting, it has an identity as that painting. So that's the unit. Well, not all paintings have unity. You can tell, though, when you're looking at a painting if it has unity. You can tell when you're looking at a painting if it's harmonious. And harmony is different than unity, because harmony doesn't have so much to do with identity as it has to do with that sense of wholeness. This is whole.
Complement.
It's healthy. It's complement. Yeah, it's got beauty. The harmony is where the beauty is. And then you have contrast or conflict. Well, why would you want to have conflict in a painting? Well, without conflict, it becomes like wallpaper. It just becomes boring. So there has to be some conflict or some contrast. Now, contrast can be very beneficial, like you're contrasting when you put orange and blue next to each other. They're a perfect contrast with each other. But what they're doing is enhancing each other, because the orange makes the blue look more blue, and the blue makes the orange look more orange. And black and white are kind of the same way. When you put them right next to each other, they enhance, or they get you to focus on the otherness of the other thing.
Yeah, the situation.
So there's a purpose in contrast as well. And then dominance, I've talked about before. The way the world thinks about dominance is the one that's the most powerful, the one that comes in and tells you what to do, or the big boss at the top of the hierarchy, the bad guy, the patriarchy. But in art, the dominance is on a painting, the field of the painting is providing a substrate, a cushion, basically, upon which the jewel of the focal point can sit. And so the focal point is a very small part of the real estate of a painting, but that's the important part of the painting. But the dominance of the painting is the servant to the focal point. So love is always in the service of that which is higher, that which is most important. But so dominance is that kind of a thing rather than a top-down coercion. It's this supportive servanthood. Um,
It's really interesting to hear you that, as a musician here, that's my background. I got my undergrad in biblical studies and minor in music, but basically did the contemporary worship thing for about 15 years in the church. And when I hear about the dominant, I'm thinking about like the root note,
mhm,
and
mhm,
and it's not like its role is to dominate, but the harmonies that accentuate that, and you said that make it
mhm.
beautiful, and it's more like a grounding as
Yes,
opposed to
yes.
like a dominating thing, but it grounds, we're in this key and this is kind of grounding us, and there's these contours and the
Mhm.
melody and coloration with the harmony. And it's funny because I'm actually color deficient. I can see color, but I'm, where the primary colors work real good for me, but then when you start getting into the shades, I kind of lose touch. My sister's an artist, like an actual artist, and but I'm much more auditory, like, and those things make more sense to me, in conversation, but also, with music, it was always much more the way that I could even pay attention. Um, a lot of times when I'm listening, I close my eyes because it's almost like those don't help me.
Mhm.
But it's interesting to hear those parallels, and it's like, well, obviously there's fundamentals of a fundamental reality, but at the same time, when I went back to school, to have to start a new career, I went into nursing and studied a lot of biology and microbiology, and that was 2017, and that's whenever I hear Jordan Peterson say something along the lines of, Western civilizations held together by a metaphorical or a narrative substrate. Here I was like looking in my anatomy physiology book at the cell, and I was learning about enzymes and substrates holding these things together. And when you're talking about the unity of the whole, yeah, we've broken things down all the way to the bottom, and it's like, what, we don't know what else is there. There's nothing there. So the reality is actually within the unity of these things, not in the individual pieces.
Mhm.
And you think about the human, or nature, or the universe, but even down to the cell, all these things are unities, and that, like you said, that just automatically points to a large project by Peugeot in the fractal nature of reality. And it is interesting as we have these conversations, and we're like, okay, yes, and you've had hundreds of these conversations, I think.
Yeah.
Uh, how has that continued to inform you, change you, or hone you, or all those things? What kind of effect has that had on you?
That's a really good question. The, if I just speak the truth about it, I would have to say that I understand that scientists would always say, "You shouldn't have something in mind and then try to find it because you're gonna have confirmation bias everywhere." So, but what can I do? I had this thing in mind, and I'm talking to all these people. And the conversations that I have enriched my vision and have made the vision bigger and broader, but it hasn't changed it at all. So either that means that what I'm discovering through all these conversations is that my original picture is true, or what I'm discovering is that I'm hopelessly mired in confirmation bias. So, I mean, I don't know what to say. Um, the more people that I talk to, the more certain that I am that the universe is an ongoing design engine, sort of. I mean, that the big argument that scientists always have is they don't want the idea of God intervening in the world. They don't want God intervening in the particles. But God is both outside of space and time and inside of space and time. And that means that whatever God does outside of space and time is also happening inside of space and time because he's in both places. So this it's not as though he's intervening in situations here and there. It's he is the reality, and somehow or another we've been given an opportunity to participate in that reality, and we either participate or we choose not to participate, and that's the 0 or 1 that we always have when we're either moving closer or moving further
Mhm.
away. That's our free will in operation. But that also means that this this creativity is going on everywhere. Down at the cell level, I think it's going on in the particles. When I hear physicists talk sometimes about how things hold together, you have to believe that there's something holding things together. They talk about the forces. Okay, you can talk about a force, but what is it? You can describe it. That doesn't mean that you've told me what it is or where it came from or um, why atoms hold together or why atoms clump up into molecules. Yes, there are forces, but there are also forces that are moving towards something that has meaning and purpose. All those chemical elements have meaning and purpose. They're all useful for something.
Mm.
And yeah, I mean, I just am more and more in awe. I mean, I'll tell you, my times of worship have really deepened in the last 4 years because the bigger that God gets in my mind, the more I'm driven to my knees in just absolute awe at his majesty and his glory, and there's a comfort in discovering how small I am
Mm.
because, you know, I don't know if you can remember back to what it was like. I can't really remember back to what it was like being held by my father or being held by my mother, but I have a picture of me when I was 3 years old and walking alongside my dad and holding his hand. And, I didn't have a great relationship with my dad, and that was probably the last time he ever held my hand when I was 3 years
Mm.
old,
Wow.
but looking at that picture just gives me it gives me that image of, what it is to be held, to be loved, to be nurtured by, a truly capable, glorious father,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's interesting to have the burning question, to go on the journey, to the pursuit, to seek the answer, and I wouldn't say at the end of it, but along the way, you find yourself more and more. And you mentioned this when we were kind of backstage about the introduction or your description on your channel, but it's like feeling more and more like you're finding yourself in a deeper childlike faith.
Mhm.
And a lot of times that's critiqued as a type of ignorance, but it's almost like a type of vulnerability more than it is just, oh well, throw up your hands. No, it's like, oh, I'm pursuing this and it makes me feel, like you said, more small and vulnerable in the reality of something great. And I think that's awesome. And as I was listening to talk about that, and the few podcasts that I was listening to kind of researching for this, um I was kind of curious about like the journey. There's kind of a before and after Peterson. I mean, we've kind of gone back. He has this kind of dominant note in this space as something, focal that this is orbiting around in a way because he punched through. How did it? Where did you find yourself like before that? Were you in a different space, um, emotionally, life, whatever?
Um, I would say about a year or 2 before I ran into Jordan Peterson, I came to some conclusions in my own life, and then when I ran into Jordan Peterson, it was like, "Oh, yes, that's exactly what happened, what he's talking about right there." So, I mean, he was more of a descriptive mechanism for me to understand what it was that had happened. But and I don't know if my story is the normal story, but I found myself at about the age of 60 thinking, you know, I'm still an adolescent in so many ways because there are things that I just haven't let go of that I just can't seem to get past. And I'm not saying this now as though I've gotten past it even now, but at least now I recognize what it is. It took me that long to even
Mhm.
recognize that there was a problem. And part of what had happened was that I went on an eating program where I didn't eat any sugar or any flour, and I didn't eat between meals, and I didn't eat after meals. So I'm eating just 3 meals a day and no sugar and no flour. And I lost a lot of weight, and it was great, and I felt fantastic. But the one thing that happened was that I lost all interest in doing art, and so I stopped painting. And I'm reflecting on that and kind of thinking, well, I feel very at peace with this eating program because when you're not eating sugar, you're not eating flour, your anxiety level goes way down, and inflammation and pain and everything else disappeared. And when you're not eating between meals, food is not always taking up your mind share. So you have a lot of time and you get a lot of other things accomplished. And I began to have more time to reflect on areas of sin in my own life in the way that I was thinking about the world. And one of those ways was I realized that even though the way that I would participate in the political sphere was as a conservative, in my actual thinking, I had a victim mindset. I had a victim mentality. Like, oh, if only my husband was, more accepting of me being overweight, then I wouldn't be so anxious and I wouldn't be so tempted to be eating all the time. If only this, if only that. It's always blaming everything on somebody else. And I came to a recognition that this is my life. I only have this one life. And the choices that I'm making are affecting my future. And if I'm making choices that are damaging to me, it doesn't, I can blame it on somebody else, but that's not going to help me at all. The only thing that's going to help me is to make a change for myself. And so that year and a half or so that I was in that very restricted eating program was really transformed my thinking about a lot of things. And then I went through a pretty major surgery. So I was housebound for about 6 weeks. And I had run into Jordan Peterson a little bit before this surgery. But then after I had the surgery, I started watching his biblical lecture series because I had the surgery. He was about halfway through that first summer of the biblical series. So I binged all the first episodes, and then week by week, I would listen to the next episode. And I filled in between watching some of his college lectures, started getting educated on all these things. And then I'm hearing him talk about these things, and I'm starting to put the pieces together. Oh, that's where that victim mindset came from. And that's, this is why the fasting, basically, I was doing a kind of fasting, and that fasting was clearing up my mind and clearing up my spirit so that I could see clearly into my own actions and get rid of that victim mindset. But, when you live 60 years with a victim mindset,
Mhm.
it's pretty hard to ditch it at the other end.
Mm.
So, um, and again, this sounds like I'm blaming. Then, shortly after that, COVID comes along. And so then I started gaining weight back during COVID because I wasn't getting out I wasn't as active. I wasn't going to the gym. I wasn't as careful about my eating. And that sugar thing got hold of me again. I have an addiction to sugar, or maybe my father was an alcoholic. And so maybe I have a predilection to alcoholism. And so the sugar really triggers that.
Yeah.
But again, this is my choice. I'm not a victim to this thing. I've seen that I can make better choices for myself. And so I do battle with that thing all the time.
Mm.
I wake up in the middle of the night sometimes thinking, why did I do that? Today's going to be different. um, anyway, that's one of my personal struggles. So I'm always also thinking about that thing when I'm talking to people, like how how do we um, how do we continue that walk in truth? Because even something like that is one of these choices of truth or not truth.
Yeah.
And it's really hard to come to terms with my own weaknesses in that area and recognize this is why I love Jordan Peterson. Again, he collapses everything down into humility and gratitude. So I'm always most successful when I'm focused on the gratitude, which reminds me of the humility, which reminds me of the gratitude.
Yeah. That.
Gets me out of the mix. Instead of focusing on me all the
Mm.
time, gets my focus upward.
There's a lot too. I think I found myself in the terrible situation that I was based off of a life of a type of addiction. Not wanting to be honest about something I was deeply shamed about that
Mhm.
created a cycle that led me, it's like you think about that idea of like a ball bearing that's like out of, or something that's out, or in a machine that's something that's spinning, and it's like just one little thing, it'll just slowly, veer the whole piece off until it's just completely wobbling off the tracks. That's definitely how it felt like for me. And again, I think it's like that idea of being honest with yourself or with somebody else about that, like that continual journey is what helps you shore up the path. And we also probably deal with ideas of wanting to do something perfectly, and then that creates shame in different things. And one of the interesting things coming into this conversation, as you've talked, as we both, talk about this, we've fanboyed and fangirled out on Jordan Peterson quite a bit, and I think it's been difficult. And this journey has allowed me to getting online, having these conversations, to help people understand why he was so significant to me during this time. And you've done a beautiful job of like joining me in that. But even for when he was then hoisted and co-opted to be a political figure, and, it's partly by his choice, I think, but also that's what a certain contingent of people, that's their only experience is that. And so somebody like my wife over the years has had questions like, I need you to help me understand, like, because this is what people see or what I've seen, and like how did he do this? And I went to his and for one, you're a woman talking about this, and I think that's part of the question, part of that implicit in the question is, why does it seem like all these guys are all attracted to Jordan Peterson? And there's some different answers for that. So I'd be interested, for one, for you as a woman, why that you feel like maybe that made sense for you. But two, when I went to recently one of his tour stops here in Arkansas in Little Rock, I did have this distinct feeling that there were a lot of people there wanting to posture near him for political reasons, more than the reasons that are implied and also explicit in the space that we're operating in right now, and conversation and other conversations. And I try that actually gave me a lot of clarity, because I saw that, because I'm kind of myopic in my experience. But when I kind of came into this group of people, and I walk in the one example I had was, I walk out and there's probably like 4 or 5 young 20 something year old men standing there, and he made like 3 woke jokes, like 3, and everything else was about Genesis and Abraham and sacrifice and all these wonderful, true things. And even in his Q&A, there was something even about how to stay faithful to your person, your spouse, or whatever, when there's all this temptation in the world. It was just wonderful stuff. And I walk out the doors, and that's what I hear them talking about, are these 3 little throwaway jokes that he said from stage. And it was like, oh, that's just what they're looking for. I mean, they're just like waiting for him to finish talking about the other stuff. And that's obviously not everybody's story. That's 10,000, 8,000 people that are there. But I was like, there is a reality to this, you know, as like I said, as we've fanned out on him a little bit here, but that there's also this contingency of this other side of things. So I guess one.
Well, I mean, in a way, it's good that we can recognize that he has flaws. He's a human being.
Yeah.
And he afterwards, he probably realized that that was not the best strategy, you know, to make those jokes. But in the moment, you know, I don't know if you ever heard him when he taught about Hitler. And he said, Hitler became who Hitler became, not just because that was in Hitler to begin with, but he was responding to his crowds. And he would say something to the crowd, and then he would feel, how are they responding to this? And he would give them more of what they wanted, you know?
Audience capture.
Okay, well, I don't know what the terminology is, but anyway, so Hitler becoming who he became was a combination of Hitler and the crowd. And I think Jordan Peterson has probably been fighting that temptation the entire time that he's been speaking to all these massive crowds of people, trying not to fall into that trap. And yet, I went to see him when he was on the very first tour. He came through San Francisco, and I bought tickets for my 2 daughters and myself. And I had high hopes for this evening because I wanted them to be exposed too. But Dave Rubin was opening for him on that first tour. And Dave Rubin was just so openly political in the opening, and woke jokes and all kinds of, you know, really political stuff. My girls didn't hear anything that followed that. They didn't hear anything after that. You know, it was a complete throwaway. There was all kinds of good stuff in that lecture, but it was contaminated by the political stuff. And all the beautiful things that Jordan has said and all of his great teaching and everything. And then he gets all up on this swimsuit issue thing and contaminates another whole generation of young people who either are for or against him on that issue. And it's just, you know, I trust, you know, he says that he has people that he trusts who talk to him and keep him in line on things. But on some of those things, I believe there's some kind of fear operating there, this fear of the whole society going down, you know, the culture going down. And he probably feels like he's fighting against it kind of alone because he sees the big picture. I know he sees a bigger picture than most of the people who are criticizing him, because I've been around a long time. And I was in politics back in the early 1980s. I held a public office.
Yeah, I saw that on your Twitter bio.
And became very controversial at the time. Lots of nasty press was written against me at the time. And I know what it feels like. But I also know what I saw when I was in the center of the political field. And I know exactly where we have come from and where we're headed. And so I have this big picture, and I know his picture is even bigger than mine because he's got a much bigger head. So he's got this big picture of what's coming down the pike, and he's got some fear about that because I don't think he's yet come to the place of recognizing how big God is and that God is sovereign. And there may be things coming that are terrifying to think about if you have to face them without the Lord, but with the Lord, he will make a way. I am confident of that, however that looks. But at least Jordan is honest when he says speak the truth, even if you recognize that speaking the truth is going to have personally terrible consequences for you. It's still important to speak the truth. I don't know if you ever read Fox's Book of Martyrs. I read that
Some
read that early in my walk of faith back in 1981, and I was forever changed by that.
Mhm.
These people who spoke the truth, even when it meant being burned at the stake, even when it meant being flayed alive, then that may be in our future. Who knows? We don't know. It's happening in some places in the world today, having to speak the truth or get your head taken off. And but I do know that when you walk with a confidence in God, that you don't have to walk around in fear all the time. You can offload that fear onto Him, and He will
Mm.
replace it with His love. So,
That makes me think about even at Symbolic World. I was there, got the T-shirt. uh, he would, he was a surprise guest or whatnot, and he still had some light security with him in this 500 person auditorium. A bunch of people that are there to nerd out on symbolic meaning. It's like if you're not safe here, and yeah, he's got a huge global profile, but that's what that makes me think of is that, and that kind of makes me sad. The other piece I wanted to ask you about was maybe in YouTube is for sure dominated, skewed towards men in viewership. I think it's still that way, anyways. It's been talked about a lot, and coming into this space, like I was saying, as what do you, I do feel like it's unique for a woman to to gravitate, like it's lesser, everyone was talking about the manosphere with Jordan Peterson early on. Like what is it about you that made that connection, I guess?
well, I mean, truth be told, I'm probably more masculine in the way that I think about the world.
Okay.
I'm very feminine in the way I think about men. but
Clear.
but when I was in college, I remember very much if we were at parties, I'd always want to be in the kitchen talking with the guys because they were talking philosophy and
Mm.
they were talking ideas, and the girls would all be out there either talking about, bridal magazine, or if they were already married, they'd be talking about the babies. And I was way more interested in ideas. And so I was always hanging out with the guys. So there is probably that part of me. I think one of the things that happens to people over time as you walk through life with Christ, the rough edges get worn off, and you kind of get balanced, more and more balanced. I don't know if you remember, maybe 15 years ago, there was a thing going around where you could take these tests to decide if you were an otter,
Golden
beaver,
retriever.
golden retriever, or a lion. And as I was taking the test, I was reflecting on my life and thinking, well, 20 years ago, I would have answered the question this way, but now I have to answer it this way because I've changed in this area. And I realized that 20 years before, I probably would have been almost completely lion. But now it's like all four quadrants were pretty equal, really. Now, that could mean I've just lost my identity and I'm a big nothing. Or it could mean that something has gotten more balanced. And I think that the masculine side of the way that I used to think, and I think that was partly because I grew up in a household where my father was very domineering and my mother allowed herself to be domineered. She was a lovely person, but she was really squashed by my dad. And so in my mind, subconsciously, he was the winner. And if I wanted to be a winner, I had to be more like him than to be more like her. So I picked up some of this masculine way of thinking, I think. but not in the way they talk about today with, like, your gender is that or something. It was just more the way that he looked at the world. He was intellectual and he liked ideas and all that kind of thing, and that was what I gravitated towards. Um, but then later in life, after I had, had my children, then those things were very important to me too. But I've never given up my curiosity about the world. I'm just relentlessly curious about everything, which is my big problem, because if I had stopped 2 years ago and just written my book, I would have gotten somewhere. But now it's expanded. There's so much more stuff. Every day I'm taking in new stuff until this picture has gotten like way out of control. And there's no way I can zone it into like one little fragment and try to
Mhm.
explain anything. I can't make an outline anymore, because the minute I start making an outline, it's like a zip file. It opens up to another thing that opens up to another thing.
There's a sub point. You just keep sub pointing all the way
Yeah,
across
yeah.
the page.
52 subpoints under every point.
Well, maybe you could make a volume series. You know,
What's that?
well, just like a series. Different volumes, not just one book.
Uh-huh.
I as I was doing some other research, I went up to your art website, and the thing that stuck out to me was your series. I don't know what you call them. You have the different sections, the different series that you've done in art, and one was called LivingWater.
Mhm.
And of course it stuck out to me because I have a piece of art. I wrote a song called LivingWater.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Cool.
So that was like, oh, so I just
You're
kind
gonna you're gonna do it for me?
of, I don't have, I don't have, I'm not set up for it. Maybe if we got a little time afterwards or something, but yeah, so I was curious about how that came about, because it's probably of songs I've written, probably one of my first or second favorite. And so yeah, I was wondering where, obviously I read that the passage from like John 14 under one of them, I think it was. But yeah, I was just interested in that. Tell me about those.
Yeah, oh, that's really cool that you asked that question, because that's going back a ways. That's probably, I don't know, 15 years ago, maybe. Um, the way that I learned about all this creativity stuff was that I took a class with this guy um, who taught. Um, he didn't teach you how to paint. He just taught you how to see. So the way that he ran the class was, there were 20 students, and each of us were tasked with painting 2 large paintings every week on the same picture, the same image. I mean, everybody could choose their own image. Everybody could paint whatever they wanted to. If they wanted to paint a vase of flowers, they could paint a vase of flowers. If they wanted to paint a house, they could paint a house. Whatever they wanted to paint, they could paint that. But every week it had to be the same thing, 2 big paintings of the same thing. So at the end of this class, you end up with 20 large paintings of whatever it is that you're doing, 20 paintings of your vase of flowers, or 20. So when I started that class, I had a bunch of photographs of things that were interesting to me. And one of them was a picture of this guy sitting at a table at a cafe, and there was a pitcher of water, and there were 2 glasses there. And he was alone. And as I was contemplating that picture, I started to think, well, first of all, why is he alone? Second of all, why is the pitcher of water still full? Why are the glasses empty? And that just led me on a trail of, maybe there would be some different ideas that I could try to paint with each version of this guy sitting at the table with the 2 glasses of water. So for the first 4 or 5 paintings, it's the guy sitting at the table with the 2 glasses of water and the pitcher of water. But as it went along, I thought, well, there's something about that water. I want that water to look so enticing that when you're looking at the painting, you will see, oh, he wants to reach out and pour that water into the glass, you know. And then as the series moved along, I finally got to the point where I had to break the rules because I started to feeling like that water is taking on a life of its own, and that water is moving out into a wave. And then that wave is taking shape, and then you can see in the background. And so as the series went along, the water became more and more representative of Christ. And then the water goes from just being a blue wave to being this multicolored image of Christ. And then the water becomes, then I heard this song by Rich Mullins,
Hmm.
My Deliverer is Coming. You remember that song?
I don't know that one specifically, but I know Rich.
Oh, well, you got to go back and listen to My Deliverer is Coming. It's one of the great songs of all time, I think. And he's talking about the water flowing out of Lake Sangra's broken heart. And Lake Sangra was this lake in the Kenyan plain. There's a Kenya, as in Africa. There's the canyon walls, and then the water's flowing out of Lake Sangra's broken heart, like in this waterfall coming down into the valley below. And the picture that came up in my mind was those two canyon walls. Christ is the bridge on those two canyon walls. So he is the living water. So I painted it as the image of Christ. The water was the image of Christ bridging the canyon walls. And in every one of those paintings, I felt very inadequate to represent what was in my mind. And the paintings are not good paintings by any stretch of the imagination. Anybody that would look at them would say, well, she doesn't really know how to paint. She doesn't really know how to represent what's in her head. But that wasn't the point. The thing was in my head, and I wanted to get it out and get it on the paper. And in spite of my inadequacy, God used those images in people's lives, especially that one of the living water bridging the canyon. That just spoke to a lot of people. Even if they couldn't maybe clearly see what I was trying to do in the painting, when they would ask me about it, I could explain to them what I was trying to do. And that really spoke to people. So there's something about being faithful to the vision, even when you don't have the skills needed to represent it fully. Because what you learn then is I need more skills, and I can build my skills now. So the next time I try something like that, I can get closer. And then the next time it rolls around, then you have a bigger vision that's harder to represent. So you have to keep, you have to keep growing. So anyway, that's what that series was about.
That's really beautiful. It really moves me. I wrote that song in my mid-20s. I'm 39. And it's not so much the song, but it's that story that you're telling about, growing and learning and gaining, hopefully, wisdom to attach to these skills or to this art, or for a use that you couldn't have really thought about existing, as a younger person. And the church that I had served at, whose trust I betrayed, and I ended up going back to church there after about 6 months with my family, and just attended there for 6 years, didn't do anything, just came on Sunday mornings half asleep because I worked night shift the night before as a nurse. And this whole life of being a worship leader, I set it aside. It's very painful.
Mm-hmm.
And you talk about losing whenever you had that transformation, a physical transformation, a spiritual transformation in your life, you lost your, I don't know if connection or desire, or there was a time where art was set aside for whatever reason.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely have experienced that. I didn't really listen to music for almost 3 or 4 years. When I was studying for school, I was listening to like soundtracks, and definitely didn't listen to Christian music, and it had to be healed in my life. So I find myself now, some sad things happened at that church in the last year. And that was a church I was a part of for about 20 years. And, there's a redemptive story there, and there was lots of relationships and stuff, but no longer a part of it in the instantiation that it is today. So, but I find myself with a community in a role of serving and taking that art and even sometimes those songs that I used to think if I sang this song that then I'm making this about me, instead of seeing that these songs could be a gift to other people.
Mhm.
And which was so ironic that was, being somebody that was what I did, but I didn't have that piece of me worked out. It was still too broken. But yeah, deeper into that and it being redeemed and it being used for, and I'm now, like I said, with this small community, just using the art and the gifts and things that I didn't think I thought they were gone. So that's the story though, isn't it? That's that good old story. And yeah, I don't know, but it was interesting hearing you talk about losing that desire for, or whatever that was, inspiration. There's a piece on that I wanted to hit on, because when I was younger, I actually, I dressed cool and I was doing this music thing, but I never felt like a creative person. I always felt like I was maybe innovative, okay, because most of what I did was cover songs for the church. I
Mhm.
wasn't really I wasn't creating. And so in this foray, especially into this thing that we're even doing right now, it has felt like one of the most creative processes that I've ever done. And and that I think that I shamed myself or something about what it meant to be creative. And I'm trying to be open and honest and let things kind of, and not put too much pressure, like when I'm approaching something, like I have to get it right. It's like, oh, well, we can, I guess he said, scratch that out with black and rework where it feels like it needs to. And I don't know, that was really beautiful. And so, I mean, that's been a really cool conversation in regards to creativity and where that meets and where that converges and has emerged in this conversation.
Well, I certainly resonate with you when you say that you went through many years where you didn't feel like a creative person, because that was exactly my experience.
Yeah.
When I first started painting, I wasn't even painting because I wanted to be creative. We had moved into a house that had high ceilings, so I had a lot of blank walls, and I couldn't afford to buy original art, but I thought it would be nice to have some original art on the walls, so maybe I could go take a class and learn how to do some original art. And at that point, I was 50 years old.
Hmm.
It's really terrifying to start something new when you're 50, because, at least in my case, I was terrible at it when I first started. I felt so foolish. Um, this is one of the great things about Jordan Peterson, is when he reminds you that the fool has to come before the master. I
Mhm.
haven't gotten to master yet, but I've certainly been through fool. And that whole aspect of being a fool almost made me quit many times, because I just couldn't bear the feeling of my work looking like something that an elementary school child had done. And I could see around me people that were, you know, making beautiful things, and I didn't have the background in drawing, I didn't have the background in painting, I didn't know what I was doing. Um, but then when I took this class in creativity, the thing that broke it open is that because the class had these very tight constraints, you were constrained to, first of all your paintings had to be the same size, large, same large size. All of them had to be of the same topic. and you weren't allowed to deviate on that. When you put the painting up for people to look at, you weren't allowed to make excuses for it or to say where you failed. Or
Mm.
this was very important because the temptation is always to kind of put your hands up with a shield and say, I know you're going to criticize this, but let me tell you, I already know what's wrong with it. So let me tell you what's wrong. You weren't allowed to do that at all. You just had to put it up there and stand back and let people say what they were going to say. And that's terrifying, but also very healing in many ways. And you just learn so much about yourself. And when you have to paint the same thing over and over and over and over again, you have to get to a place where you just say, well, I'm tired of this. But what if I tried that? Well, what if I did this? Well, what if it is a failure? I'll just do another one. And over time, you get this body of work and you can look back at it and you can say, okay, there are both strengths and weaknesses in this body of work. What can I learn from the failures? Because that's all we ever really learn from anyway, is the failures.
Yeah.
But what strengths can I carry with me into the next body of work? So it's never that body of work is the end of it. So I ended up taking that class 8 times. And, I told you I quit painting when I went through that period of fasting. After I started listening to Jordan Peterson and after my body healed back up again, I did one more series, and that was where the cello series came from, the one that's the intro on my channel, which was putting that all together was the work of Chris Petkow, by the way, who's absolute genius with that kind of stuff. So he's the one that came up with the idea of marrying all those cello paintings together.
Yeah.
And does Chris still have you run into Chris Petkow's channel? Oh, I wonder if he's still doing his channel because he's got just brilliant stuff. He was Grim Grizz before Grim Grizz was Grim Grizz.
Okay.
Chris goes back a few years. Anyway, I came back and did one more series, and that was the cello series. And it was quite different than all the other series. Before I came to that conclusion about myself, when I went through that time of fasting, I think a lot of my artwork was coming out of pain and anxiety and things that were in my unconscious that I wasn't aware of. And so the paintings were an attempt to communicate my way through all these things that I couldn't articulate with words. And I went through that time of fasting and watching all the Jordan Peterson stuff and doing a lot more reading and then starting to try to articulate some of my thinking with words. I had less of a need to represent it in paint. But when I came back to do that painting of the cello series, it was much more, I was interested in the concepts that I was trying to communicate. So I was trying in a kind of a more, I don't know how to explain it, a more intentional way to represent concepts. So each one of those cello paintings is an attempt to represent a particular kind of rhythm or mood of the music itself. And that's what tied together the theme of each of those paintings in terms of the colors and the rhythm used in the painting and all that kind of thing. So it was a little bit more of an intellectual exercise than the work had been before. But now I haven't painted for the most part for ever since I started the channel, because the channel takes up all my creative energy and all my time. I did recently do a very large piece, 80 by 80.
Goodness.
No, 80 by 60 for a couple that I've known for many years that were celebrating their 30th anniversary, and they'd gone through some serious difficulties in their marriage, and they wanted me to do a painting that represented the darkness and the chaos and coming out of the darkness and chaos into the light. So that was a labor of love and a challenge to try to represent that. And so the way that I painted it was with a tree, with the roots were down in the darkness, and the left side of the tree was kind of broken and burned, but then as the tree moved out into the light, the tree gets more filled with life, and then the light and the shining up over in the upper right-hand corner. So it was a lot of fun to paint that for them,
Is
but
that
exhausting, physically exhausting. I'm old enough. I'm
imagine?
75 now, so it's physically exhausting to do that kind of work.
Is that on your website?
No, no. No, I haven't updated my website for 5 years, so there's except for the cello series, that would be the newest stuff that's on the website.
I'd be interested to see that piece. I don't know
Yeah,
if
well, some paintings, they just do better in the really big paintings do better in real life than they
yeah, I'm
do
sure.
in a photograph, because what I try to do when I'm doing a painting of that size is not just to have the big picture, but that when you look at the painting, every square inch of the canvas is interesting and fascinating and leads you to the focal point. So, it's stuff that you can't see when you're looking at a photograph of it.
Mhm.
You can't see all the it's not detail exactly as much as, the meaning. I don't know, the meaning that goes into it. You can't see in a photograph, I guess. You can only see it in person.
Well, maybe someday.
Yeah.
So
Where do you Oh, you live in
I
Arkansas.
live in Arkansas, yeah. So
Well,
we're
this
kind
painting is in Sacramento, so
of
that's where
okay.
Paul is. So if we
Yeah,
ever
well,
do a conference in Sacramento,
we could
maybe
work
we
that
can
out.
bring that painting out and people can see it.
That'd be quite the effort. 80 by 60 feet. That's crazy.
80 by 60 inches.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, 80 by 60 feet, that would be
Oh,
something.
yeah, I'm showing my hand of how much I know about art, which is funny. We're coming up on time. I have a story I wanted to share with you. I
Yeah.
forgot. Um, so I had my first real encounter with art about a year and a half ago, where it captured my subconscious in a conscious way, and I kind of had like an experience with it. And what's comical about it is that it was Thomas Kincaid.
Oh my. He had 2 kinds, I don't know what kind. He also did landscapes that were utterly glorious, beautiful landscapes, but then he had this thing where he did the little cottage with the river and
Oh yeah,
with the light. Yeah.
that's what captured me. That's what spoke to me. And I was in a therapy session, and I think I had just finished it up, dealing with, it's been a long journey. When I talked about that betrayal that I did in my life and my marriage, that was coming up on about 7.5 years ago. And I didn't mention this, but I am reconciled with my wife and our family, and it's been a healing process all the way out to this point where I started doing this a couple of months ago. But I was in that session or finishing it up, and I could see this kind of platonic Kincaid cabin,
Mhm.
like not one that I knew specifically, but just this kind of representation that I knew what it was. And it was like cold and snowy, and there was a gray sky behind it. But obviously inside the house, there's this, this typical light that
Mhm.
apparently his art represents some kind of affectatious reality or something like that. That I learned that word from Jonathan Peugeot when I kind of briefly told him about this at the conference. Uh, but I realized when I was seeing that, I had just a clear understanding that I did not, until that truth came to reality, that I never lived inside that house with my family. I never inhabited that warm space. And I would go in and, eat and say hi, but I lived out like at one of those campfires that he paints. That was where I stayed. And it made sense to me. And I was thinking about the fact that now that I do have that intimacy, I do live in that warmth, I do live in that reality, but that there's people that I know that I love deeply that don't. And I made that contrast. It was just one of those like, phew, wow, okay. I looked up a picture, I found one that looked pretty much like what I was seeing. And And I was telling my sister about it, who I told you she's an artist, and she goes, well, you know how Thomas Kincaid died recently? I was like, no, I don't know. Well, he overdosed. He was an addict. I thought, oh, that's why he's never inside those cabins. And
Well, I've followed his life a little bit in the early years, and I think he might be a perfect example of what you used that word audience capture. Because he did a couple paintings that to him were representing the light of Christ. And he found a way to get that light to look real on the canvas. That's not easy, to get light on a canvas to actually look like the light is coming through the canvas. It's a little bit of a trick of the way that you use the colors and the neutrals and the brights against each other. But he found a way of representing that. And his first few were really beautiful. But that got him famous. And when you get famous for something, the only way you can stay famous is to do more of the same. And so he did more of the same, more of the same, more of the same. Pretty soon you're just phoning it in, just phoning it in. Come up with a new image. And then pretty soon he's selling this stuff like hotcakes, and the galleries, he's got galleries everywhere. And then they're doing prints of this stuff, and the prints are selling for tens of thousands of dollars for a print of one of these paintings. And it was audience capture. And after a while, the real artist isn't inside there anymore, because he's not doing what's really inside his heart. Every once in a while, I'd see one of these landscapes where he'd be out on a beach and just do a plein air thing of the beach. Beautiful craft, absolutely beautiful. But he couldn't do that and still make money at it. So he's over here doing this other thing that's no longer got any meaning for him. And that's when he started drinking. That's when the drugs started. That's the story I tell myself anyway. And I think it happens to quite a few artists where they discover what it is that's going to open the cash register. Maybe it doesn't happen to everybody, because they continue to have creative ideas that people will buy. But the galleries tend to want you to produce more things that look like what they just sold, so they can put another one on the wall and somebody will come in and buy it. And they'll recognize, oh, that's a Thomas Kincaid. So, when you look at my website, it's all over the map. There's nothing connects to anything else. Nothing makes any sense with anything else. So, obviously I would never be a gallery artist, because, I don't have a style that is representative, but and I'm not just making an excuse for why I don't make a lot of money at it. Seriously. Fortunately, I have a husband who takes wonderful care of me, and I have absolutely no need to make money at art. So,
well, hopefully that's not, hopefully, well, as we're kind of closing down here.
Before we close down, I want to throw out a question for you to ponder,
Okay.
especially since you have background in biology and you have some understanding of that thing. A thought came to me today, and I don't know enough about biology to think my way all the way through it. So I'm going to outsource it to you.
All right.
I was thinking about, and I'm just going to use one example here. So I like to do my best to look attractive. And in recent years, I've come to realize that part of why I'm doing that is because I love my husband, and he likes to look at beautiful things. He likes to look at someone who looks attractive. So in the world today, people would say, oh, men are such slobs because they demand that women be beautiful, and they're only interested in hot women and all that. And I don't think that that's what's really happening. I think that in a loving relationship, the one partner wants to give a gift of love to the other partner. And so if what he enjoys is beauty, then the gift of love I'm going to give to him is as much beauty as I can muster. And it's coming out of a gift of love. And for him, his way of giving, which of course this is like love languages, his way of giving is to serve. And so he's always serving me. He puts gas in the car, or the electric car. He makes sure it's always plugged in if I have to go someplace. If I'm on a trip, he takes care of buying the airplane tickets. He's always serving me one way or another. And he's doing that out of an act of love. So there's this serving going on, right? And I'm thinking, is there that picture way deep down in the cells where what's happening there is a constant giving of love from one side to the other side, and this turning is always going back and forth. It's not one side demanding of the other side. It's one side giving what will bring pleasure to the other, and then the other side giving what will bring pleasure. So it's this picture of marriage, of the beautiful marriage where each is giving 100% and then getting back 200%, right?
Okay. This is really interesting. I worked really, really, really hard at my anatomy and physiology. Aced it, became a tutor, had a great tutor, and my father-in-law tutored me through that. He's a medical doctor, he's a physician. And so that's like the little background that I had, that I really went at this thing. So that this is exciting to have to bring this into a conversation here in this space. I actually, in my conversation I recently had with Jordan Hall, we actually talked about this related to Bitcoin. But what you're talking about, that relationship. So each cell, there's a couple, there's thousands and millions of things going on. But one of the facts that makes a cell is that it has a wall, and that wall allows for a type of relationship, a reciprocal relationship, to keep a type of homeostasis, and a balance, to keep things at 70 degrees or whatever, thermostat. So that happens like on every cell. There's a wall, and then there's these channels, and these channels help mediate concentration gradients, like an egg timer or an hourglass. So you have all the particles outside the cell, and then and inside the cell you have a bunch of particles. But something has to turn that egg timer, or that hourglass, back up to keep the balance, to keep it going. And so that's the relationship. It sounds like you're talking about is the serving and giving. And there's these inside, there's enzymes that are doing work to take sodium and potassium to keep those things equal inside the cell. And they send it back up through channels that are made specifically for sodium or potassium, so that there's always, in a healthy way, there's always this much sodium and potassium outside the cell, and this much sodium and potassium inside the cell. And it's a beautiful arrangement, the way that they needs to be at a certain ratio. It needs to be at a certain way. And there's proteins inside doing enzymes, helping facilitate that so that the equilibrium stays. And so that's what that makes me think of it relationally. And then also inside the cell, there's the mitochondrion, which is where we get the power, where we get our energy, is made in these little energy factories inside the cell. And so they also have borders. They have walls inside of them that allow for those concentration gradients, but it's with protons, hydrogen protons. So, and they filter up. It's kind of a magical relationship. It's called the electron transport chain, and there's these pieces that fold together and they move across the cell wall, and they bring parts of oxygen and that we breathe. That's like a foundational point through this, and it creates a process. And they have these little, they're kind of like turbines that you would find in something like a dam. They're very much similar to create energy. And when you get there's always the energy. There has to be more on top, like a dam holding back more water than what's below, so that the energy flows through. And the way that the pieces work together to help create, you said, like just this ongoing, continual cycle of service to help keep that going. And it's kind of like on autopilot when it's working true, like we've talked about. And so that's what that makes me think of. And as the protons flow through that, it turns it, and then that was what makes the ATP, which powers our whole body. And it actually does it in such a way that it creates more. I can't remember. There's a ratio. It's like you get one of these things in, and then 32 of these ATP come out. So it's like I don't know. I can't even remember what that process is called. Where there's other ways your body can do that, but the outcome is without it being in proper order. The outcome is like you do one of these things and you get 3 ATP. So that's like if you're holding your breath and your body has to do it on its own or something like that. It's been a long time, but I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Oh yeah, that's beautiful. That was a great representation of it. I've talked to biochemists that have been doing this work for 50 years, and they didn't do any better job than you did explaining it. So that's amazing. But as you were talking, I was reminded of one of the conversations I had a long time ago that came out because I had watched a video by this guy. I should try to round that up and send it to you. Earth's battery does exactly the same thing.
Yep.
The whole Earth, because the iron that's at the core finds its way up through these channels to the surface, and then the iron is necessary at the surface to keep the magnetic field going,
yeah.
right? But then that iron has to return back down to the center in order for the center not to run out of iron, so that there are channels where the iron gets back down into the center of the core. So this thing is this going around all that. So the whole Earth is like that. And this is not some creationist fake scientists that came up with this. These are like real legit scientists that are talking about the way that the Earth operates to keep the magnetic field going and the electric fields and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it's kind of mind-blowing, right?
That's a fractal reality.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, Karen, thank you for spending time with me today. And oh my gosh, my camera just went out. I think
I see you, but you got a suit on with a tie.
Oh yeah, that's a couple years old, but I guess I don't think I can fix it. And we're about to finish up here, so we'll end this thing backstage. But I'm going to hit a little video out if you'll hang around for just a minute, okay?
Sure.
Hi, this is Christian Baxter, and you're listening to Yours Truly, a place we go to think out loud.